All right, so this is chapter 12, so all about culture. So some of the things that are in this video are things that we talked about in class, in the last class. So some of it will be a little bit of review for you. All right, so we're going to start with defining our terms. So talking about culture, what it is. So culture, when we try to define what this means, we're typically talking about a shared way of life. Okay, so most people within a particular group kind of buy into this set of behaviors, this set of beliefs, set of patterns that characterize a group of people. So when we apply this to adolescents, we have found that in reviewing the available data, the study of adolescents in the 20th century has been very ethnocentric. So if someone is described as ethnocentric, they basically believe that their culture, their group, their way of life is superior to others. So people in all cultures, we all have a tendency to believe that our way of life is kind of the best, and that we feel negatively about other cultural groups. But generally speaking, we have found that when we look at the research that's available, this ethnocentricity is reflected in research that is largely from the United States, especially including middle socioeconomic status, white students, right, or white adolescents. So our study of adolescents is perhaps quite limited if that's our kind of primary focal point. So that's a criticism, not just of developmental psychology, but of psychology on the whole, that a lot of our research is not as culturally diverse as it should be. All right, so let's talk then about research that is trying to correct some of that ethnocentricity in the current research. So cross-cultural research essentially compares one culture with another. And even this approach is sometimes staunchly criticized because oftentimes we find that we are comparing some kind of Western approach, so meaning like Western countries, so the United States, for example, Western Europe, which tend to be very individualistic, and almost like we're using that as the standard to compare any other country that does not follow that approach. So just keep in mind that that's one approach, or one criticism rather, of cross-cultural studies. Nonetheless, though, so in the cross-cultural studies, typically we are finding that we are comparing these individualistic cultures with collectivist cultures. So in individualistic cultures, the focus is very much on, you guessed it, the individual. Yes, so the individual person. So the focus is on you, what makes you unique, what makes you different. Everything is kind of internal and set on focusing on you. So that should sound very American to you. So of course, the United States, very individualistic. Collectivist, on the other hand, as a cultural orientation, focuses more on the group. That's what a collective is, right? It's a collection, it's a group. So in collective cultures, the focus is on how do I connect to other people? How am I embedded in social relationships? The self is defined in terms of the group, and things like group harmony are viewed as more important than your own individual wants, your own individual desires. So countries like Japan and China would be great examples of collectivist culture. So the focus much more on the group. So thinking about that, right? Thinking about our different cultural orientations absolutely influences the kinds of things that we even study, not just in psychology, but just in all of our fields. So if I am hailing from an individualistic culture, well, then I would maybe want to focus on things that are connected, at least in my perspective, directly to the individual. So self-esteem, for example, right? Or individual personality traits and how these differ from person to person. Well, those kinds of things would be very relevant in an individualistic culture, but maybe not quite as relevant in a collectivist culture. So maybe instead of describing the self with personality traits the way that I might in an individualistic culture, in a collectivist culture, I might be much more likely to describe myself as connected to different social groups, right? So these are the groups that I'm a part of instead of this is how I define myself. All right, so we're going to look a little bit more fully then at some of these cross-cultural comparisons and what we find and how those are relevant for adolescent development. So when we look at 4 basic values that individualistic cultures, so think this is the United States, this is Canada, Western Europe, these are the 4 values that parents typically identify as required for children and adolescents' successful development. So the first one here is personal choice. So you being able to kind of exercise your own will. Intrinsic motivation. So doing things for the sake of enjoying them, right? So something that you do because you enjoy it, not because you have to. So kind of figuring out what your passion is, for example. Having a high sense of self-esteem, so that overall evaluation of the self and your sense of self-worth. And then self-maximization. How can you as an individual become the best that you can be, right? How can you maximize and capitalize on your own personal strengths? Those are all very individualistic. In collectivist cultures, on the other hand, then they might look more at how do I help the child or the adolescent become a contributing member of society through my relationships. So through my connection to my family or to other people who are close to me, how do I fit within the larger group? So how do I function as a piece of the whole? And then how do I show a degree of respect for those around me? So I have an obligation to those around me, and especially an obligation to those who are my elders, right? So people who are above me. So that idea of obedience to, especially to older relatives. So my grandparents would be kind of at the top of that hierarchy, that I revere them and I would never want to do anything to shame my family. And I need to show them respect and reverence at all times. Very different, right? Very different approach here. All right, so let's look then at how adolescents around the world spend their time. So we alluded to this a little bit last time. So you can see here that we have a couple of different comparisons here. So non-industrial unschooled populations. So this would be adolescents who are living in countries where school is not a mandate, right? It's not required. So you might think of economically disadvantaged countries, what you might call the developing world or the third world, although those terms are also fraught with controversy. But nonetheless, those are some of the terms that you might hear. And we can compare that then with post-industrial schooled populations. So meaning places that are economically perhaps a little bit more advanced, have more resources available, and school is a requirement for adolescents. So if we look at how are you dividing up your day? Well, my goodness, right? So in post-industrial world, very little time spent on household labor, which is interesting, but makes sense, right? So you're not really helping around the house too much, not really working that much either, especially compared to our non-industrial. Look at this one though, schoolwork. Look at this. So adolescents in the United States spending very little time on schoolwork compared to European counterparts, but even more importantly, and we talked about this a little bit in class, to their East Asian counterparts as well. So total amount of time spent working. So you can see that here too. How about this one? Time spent watching television. Interesting. Time spent talking, time spent doing sports. Interesting comparisons here. Voluntary activities, and here's the big one, total free time. So US adolescents spend less time on schoolwork, especially compared to East Asian adolescents, and US adolescents are given much more discretionary or free time, right, to kind of do whatever you want. Now, the challenge here with free time is that when adolescents are allowed to choose what they want to do with their time, they are typically not choosing things that are challenging or stimulating. They're typically choosing activities that are not challenging and are not stimulating. So something like I'm going to watch TV or I'm going to be on my phone, right? Maybe checking stuff on social media. So stuff that is typically not kind of helping them grow and develop. All right, we'll talk here about rites of passage. I will post the link to this particular video so that you can see what rites of passage look like in other countries and other cultures. So a rite of passage is like a ceremony or some kind of ritual that marks your transition from one status to another. And so in this case, marking the transition either into adulthood or marking the transition from from childhood into adolescence. So we don't have these, at least universally in every group in the United States. So some cultural groups do have these things. So you might think of, for example, if you're Jewish, a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. So that would be moving from being a child right into an adult in the eyes of the church, at least. You might also think of like a Sweet 16 party or a quinceañera, again, marking your transition into adulthood. And then in this video, you will see that there are several rites of passage that are connected to different cultural groups. I will let you watch it, and then you can decide if you would want to be part of these rites of passage. In the United States, we might think about something like high school graduation, maybe getting your driver's license as maybe more universal rites of passage. But again, we don't really have the continuity where everyone experiences exactly the same rites of passage in this country. All right, so socioeconomic status. So we've talked about this a little bit in class, but remember that socioeconomic status includes several different things. So we're grouping people together based on their occupation, their level of education, and then also economic, meaning how much money do you make? So when we look at socioeconomic status on the whole, we are looking at how much power does the person have, how much influence does the person have, and how much prestige does this person have. So we talked about this a little bit before in class, and I asked you to think of a prestigious occupation, and look at you, you came up with the number one. So a doctor is typically perceived as kind of the most prestigious occupation, but several other ones listed on here that may or may not surprise you, but these are typically occupations that are associated with high levels of occupational prestige. All right, so we'll talk then about poverty in class. I will see you next class. See you later.